Hello everyone, and welcome to the 64th episode of Analyzing Evil, featuring HAL 9000 from the Odyssey series. 2001: A Space Odyssey is considered one of the greatest films ever made, and HAL 9000, by extension, is often considered to be one of the most iconic villains ever to appear in literature or film. And though he certainly is an antagonist, and could perhaps be considered a villain, there's a debate that fans of this series have been engaging in since the creation of this sci-fi epic. Is HAL 9000 evil? There may not be a definitive answer to this question, and whether or not you believe him to be so may be determined by your own morals and thoughts on the nature of artificial intelligence. Nonetheless, in this video, we're going to try and determine whether or not there is an answer to this question, or if this is a topic that will remain in the realm of the subjective until we're given proof to the contrary. And if that's the case, at the very least, this video will serve to convey my thoughts on the matter, and if yours differ from mine, I'd love to hear them down below. To determine whether or not HAL is evil, we're going to be primarily looking at the information we're given in 2001: A Space Odyssey, as well as some additional information provided to us in 2010, Odyssey 2, that helps to clarify what exactly went wrong with HAL in the first entry in this series. HAL makes small appearances in the last two novels in this series, 2061, Odyssey 3, and 3001, The Final Odyssey. But in these appearances, HAL takes on another form entirely, and just like David Bowman, the HAL we see after his ascension might contain the original HAL, but he's definitely not anything close to being evil in those novels. So taking his appearances there into account when determining his morality in the first entry wouldn't help us much. Now, some of you may already know that HAL eventually ended up ascending to what we could call a form of godhood during the events of 2010, Odyssey 2. Now, without further ado, let's begin. Let's cover some preliminary information about HAL and his functions before we examine his actions during the Discovery voyage. HAL, which stands for Heuristically Programmed Algorithmic Computer, was created by Dr. Chandra and a group of programmers at the HAL plant in Urbana, Illinois. He was designed to be a near-perfect supercomputer with artificial intelligence to be used in advanced space travel, one whose infallibility and capability to use logic and reason of his mostly own free will would ensure that any and all errors on his ship that could possibly be encountered on long journeys, like the one Discovery made to Saturn, could be dealt with quickly and effectively. Now, it wouldn't be fair to say that HAL just operated the ship into which he was installed. Rather, HAL was the ship. Every light, every alarm, every sensor could be operated in some way by HAL. And because of this, though he was programmed to follow the commands given to him by his fellow crew members, he was in complete and total control of everything aboard the Discovery, a fact which gave him far greater power over his human counterparts than they had over him. Now, usually, before we begin examining the evil deeds of these characters, there are several different variables that we need to take into account to accurately determine their motivations for the evil actions they take, chief among them being their origin, personality traits, values, beliefs, and intent. In HAL's case, I think the best course of action here is to work backwards. Because of what he is, a supposedly infallible artificially intelligent computer, it's best that we first look at what he did, the reason why he did it, and then take a look at who HAL is, and factor that into his actions to determine whether or not you can consider them to be evil. And what HAL did is fairly simple. HAL was attempting to sever communications with Earth by claiming that a component of their communications array was faulty, but his crewmates suspected his treachery, and depending on if you're reading the book or watching the film, Frank and Dave either received instructions from Earth to disconnect HAL if he became a problem, or discussed it themselves covertly in a pod. In both instances, HAL feared for not only his continued existence, but the successful fulfillment of the mission that he'd been assigned. So HAL decided to correct this new problem he was faced with in the form of mutiny by first eliminating Frank, Dave, and the three other hibernating crewmates aboard the Discovery, and he succeeded in doing just that to Frank and the three hibernating crewmates. You'll notice I said that fear was the primary motivator here, but it goes much deeper than that. And to better understand why HAL did what he did, let's take a look at a passage from Odyssey 2, which I'll read for you now. Discovery's mission to Jupiter was already in the advanced planning stage when TMA-1 was excavated and radiated its signal to that planet. As the function of the Prime crew was merely to get the vessel to its destination, it was decided that they should not be informed of its new objective. By training the investigative team separately and placing them in hibernation before the voyage began, it was felt that a much higher degree of security would be attained, as the danger of leaks, accidental or otherwise, would be greatly reduced. As HAL was capable of operating the ship without human assistance, it was also decided that he should be programmed to carry out the mission autonomously in the event of the crew being incapacitated or killed. He was therefore given full knowledge of its objectives, but was not permitted to reveal them to Bowman or Poole. This situation conflicted with the purpose for which HAL had been designed, the accurate processing of information without distortion or concealment. As a result, HAL developed what would be called, in human terms, a psychosis, specifically schizophrenia. Dr. Chandra informs me that, in technical terminology, HAL became trapped in a Hofstadter-Mobius loop, a situation apparently not uncommon among advanced computers with autonomous goal-seeking programs. To put it crudely, HAL was faced with an intolerable dilemma, and so developed paranoid symptoms that were directed against those monitoring his performance back on Earth. He accordingly attempted to break the radio link with Mission Control, first by reporting a non-existent fault in the antenna unit. This involved him not only in a direct lie, which must have aggravated his psychosis still further, but also in a confrontation with the crew. Presumably, he decided that the only way out of the situation was to eliminate his human colleagues, which he very nearly succeeded in doing. So now that we know what HAL did, and why he did it, why do we even need to look at who he is to determine if he's evil or not? Because there are a few questions we still need to answer here before making this distinction. First of all, is there anything in his personality that could have led him to taking these actions besides his programming? Not really. He has a personality, but that personality is fairly basic, being only a tool that HAL can use to process information without need for outside stimulus and to interact with his crewmates. He has little to no inflection in his program voice, and therefore, there isn't much that you can say about his speech patterns or mannerisms, because he doesn't have any. What he does have, though, is the ability to think for himself, and emotion, or at least what limited understanding of emotion a computer has. Which brings us to our next topic of discussion. How do we know that HAL is capable of thinking for himself? In Odyssey 1, we receive a passage talking about a supposition made by the mathematician Alan Turing, who, back in the 1940s, gave an answer to the question as to whether or not a machine was capable of thought, which seems to be a sound enough answer to this question. Turing stated that if the responses generated by a machine during conversation were indistinguishable from the responses that a human would make in a similar conversation, then it stands to reason that the machine was indeed thinking. As how does one find the correct response during conversation, other than to think of that correct response? By using this logic, I would completely agree that HAL is capable of thinking, and more importantly, he's capable of coming to his own conclusions and making his own decisions. However, there's another question we need to answer when discussing HAL's ability to think, and that question is, to what degree is HAL infallible? The answer to that is only as infallible as his creators have created him to be. Unlike a human, HAL is only capable of understanding what he's been programmed to understand. Due to this, though HAL is capable of thinking, he's also fully capable of being ignorant to the point of innocence. He can learn new concepts that are in his scope of understanding, but he's incapable of abstract thought, and therefore, HAL, for all his intelligence, wasn't able to understand a few key things. The first is the difference between a secret and a lie. They both share similarities, but there is a distinct difference between concealing information from someone and deliberately altering the truth. But for HAL, they were one and the same, which, as we learned earlier, caused an unending loop of paranoia in his psyche due to this quote-unquote lie conflicting with his programming. The other thing that HAL wasn't able to tell the difference between was disconnection and death. When HAL learned that his fellow crewmates were potentially going to disconnect him, he essentially went into survival mode. Since his creation, HAL has never been offline, and though he's aware of the concept of sleep, he has no frame of reference within his own consciousness, and therefore is unable to understand how it feels to sleep, and how that's different from death. And along with him feeling like he was an instrumental component in seeing this mission to its completion, HAL panicked and followed through with the only solution he deemed to be logical. And this is how we know that HAL is able to feel some kind of emotion. Now, there are plenty of examples of human beings not being able to feel emotion for various reasons, and the reason that HAL can feel emotion doesn't necessarily apply to a human being, and that reason is because HAL can think. Though he isn't capable of abstract thought, he is aware of the unknown, and because HAL is capable of thought within his own spectrum of understanding, the unknown instills fear within him, which he expresses openly to Dave when he's disconnecting him. We don't really know if he's capable of feeling other emotions, but it stands to reason that if he can feel fear, he can feel other emotions. And emotion is the primary catalyst for irrational behavior, which HAL clearly engages in. The last question we need to answer about HAL before we determine his overall morality has two parts to it, those being, whether or not HAL has any sort of moral compass, and did HAL know that killing his human crewmates was wrong, but chose to do it anyway. We know that he's programmed to ensure the safety of his crewmates, which would indicate that on some level, he's aware that ensuring the safety and survival of those who have been assigned to his care is one of his primary functions. But as we can see by his actions, if humans interfere with his programming, or the task he's been assigned to do, he has no problem taking the most logical course of action, which includes causing harm, because he was unintentionally programmed to hold his mission and his function in higher regard than humans. But that's just it. He has no ill intent when he's engaging in this behavior. He's simply taking the actions that his programming has deemed to be the best course of action, and though he's displaying a certain degree of selfishness by eliminating these men to ensure his own survival, he's more trying to survive because he deems himself to be crucial in fulfilling his mission, rather than to save himself at the expense of others. So with all the information I've presented to you so far, what have we learned? Well, we can definitely say that what HAL did was an evil thing to do, as killing innocent people for the supposed greater good, which in this case is the successful fulfillment of a mission, is almost never the right course of action, with an emphasis on innocent people here, as it's sometimes the case that people actively committing crimes or atrocities are killed to prevent them from causing further harm, and each situation deserves to be examined on a case-by-case basis to determine the morality of the actions that take place, like we're doing now. But here, the only thing that Frank Poole and Dave Bowman are guilty of is potentially disconnecting HAL to prevent him from causing further harm, not the other way around. But can we definitively say that HAL intended to cause harm to these people for nefarious reasons? I don't think so. I think his ignorance regarding the abstract, as well as his programming, made him unable to recognize that what he was doing was wrong. So I feel that we can say with confidence that in this particular scenario, no one can be definitively labeled as evil. Rather, the actions that HAL took were evil, but what caused these actions to occur in the first place was ignorance, not malicious intent, as neither the people who programmed HAL or HAL himself could have ever been aware that a problem like this would arise. So though, again, what HAL did was evil, he didn't do it because he was evil, but because he was very literally made to operate in the way he did, and that's no fault of his, which is an important distinction that needs to be made for certain characters, and that's that one's actions don't always line up with one's character. Thank you all for tuning in to this episode of Analyzing Evil, and I hope you've enjoyed. What are your thoughts on HAL? Did I miss anything? Let me know down below, and leave a suggestion for a villain you'd like to see featured in a future episode while you're at it. If you liked this video, hit that thumbs up button, and make sure to subscribe if you haven't already. A big thank you to all of my subscribers, and to my patrons, and a most vile thank you to those whose names you're seeing on screen now. Channel's Discord server and Reddit to interact with myself and the community, and follow me on the social media platforms listed below to keep up with the channel. As always, thanks for watching, and I'll be seeing you soon.